In the dead of night, on a deserted island, the deafening roar of a plane crash shattered the silence. Among the wreckage and the few survivors, one man, Jack, a former Special Forces soldier, knew their chances of survival were slim. As days turned into weeks, hope dwindled. The survivors were losing their spirit, scavenging for the last bits of food from the plane's cargo hold. But the island held more dangers than just starvation. Strange, guttural sounds echoed from the dense jungle at night, and massive, unidentifiable footprints were found near their camp each morning. Fear began to grip the group. They were not alone. Jack, ever the pragmatist, knew they needed more than just makeshift shelters and a dwindling food supply. They needed a way to defend themselves. His eyes fell upon the mangled fuselage of the plane. An idea, born of desperation and ingenuity, began to form in his mind. He started gathering materials: a hollow metal tube from a seat frame, a spring from the landing gear mechanism, and a sturdy piece of metal from the wing. The other survivors watched him, confused and skeptical. "What are you doing, Jack?" asked Sarah, a young doctor. "Building us a fighting chance," he replied, his face grim. He worked tirelessly, day and night. He used a sharp piece of wreckage to carve and shape the wood for a stock. He meticulously fashioned a firing pin from a small, hardened steel bolt he found. The other survivors whispered amongst themselves. Some called him crazy. Others thought he was wasting precious energy. They couldn't see what he saw. They couldn't understand the cold, hard reality of their situation. He wasn't just building a tool. He was forging hope from scrap metal. He scavenged flammable liquids from the plane's broken lines and packed them into small metal canisters, creating makeshift cartridges. It was a crude, dangerous process, but it was their only shot. Finally, after days of relentless effort, it was complete. He held it up, a bizarre, Frankenstein's monster of a rifle, built entirely from the bones of the aircraft that had stranded them. It was heavy, awkward, and untested. The others gathered around, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You actually did it," someone murmured. Jack nodded, his jaw set. The real test is yet to come. That night, the familiar, terrifying sounds from the jungle grew closer, louder than ever before. The ground seemed to tremble with heavy footfalls. Something was coming for them. The survivors huddled together in fear, their eyes fixed on the dark tree line. Suddenly, a massive shape burst from the foliage. It was a creature unlike anything they had ever seen, hulking beast with matted fur, razor-sharp claws, and eyes that glowed with a malevolent red light in the dim firelight. It let out a roar that shook them to their core. Panic erupted. People screamed and scrambled backward. But Jack stood his ground. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the cold makeshift stock pressed firmly against his cheek. He took a deep breath, his Special Forces training kicking in, steadying his hands. The beast charged, its massive form a blur of speed and fury. This was it. The moment of truth. Would his creation work? Or would this be their final stand? He squeezed the trigger. Last time, we left off with the incredible story of a group of downed airmen trapped behind enemy lines who managed to craft a rifle from the wreckage of their own plane. A feat of pure genius and desperation. But what they did next? That's where the story truly becomes legendary. With their makeshift rifle in hand, they weren't just thinking about survival anymore. They were thinking about fighting back. Their leader, a man named Marcus, knew their chances were slim. They were deep in hostile territory, outnumbered and outgunned. But they had something the enemy didn't expect: unbreakable will and an ingenious weapon. Their first target wasn't a patrol or an outpost. It was something much more strategic. They'd observed a critical supply line, a narrow mountain pass used by the enemy to transport fuel and ammunition. Cutting this line would be a massive blow, disrupting operations for miles around. But it was heavily guarded. A direct assault would be suicide. So they didn't attack directly. Instead, Marcus devised a plan that relied on stealth and precision. Using the rifle, they wouldn't engage the guards. They would target the environment itself. High above the pass, there was a massive, unstable rock formation, loosened by recent rains. It was a natural death trap, just waiting for a push. Under the cover of a moonless night, they crept into position. The air was thick with tension. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Marcus took aim. This wasn't a standard rifle. It was a single-shot, manually loaded weapon built from scrap. Every shot had to count. He wasn't aiming for a person. He was aiming for a specific, small fissure in the rock face, a weak point they had identified during their reconnaissance. He took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley, a sharp crack that seemed to hang in the air forever. For a moment, nothing happened. A sickening feeling of failure washed over them. Had it all been for nothing? Then they heard it. A low rumble. It started soft, almost imperceptible, then grew into a deafening roar. The rock face began to shift. Small pebbles turned into boulders, and then the entire cliffside gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down into the pass, completely burying the road. It was an avalanche, perfectly triggered. The convoy approaching the pass screeched to a halt, its path completely blocked. Chaos erupted. The guards were confused, shouting in the dark, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the dust cloud. The airmen didn't stick around to watch. They vanished back into the wilderness, leaving behind a scene of utter pandemonium. They had effectively crippled the enemy's supply chain without firing a single shot at a person. This single act of sabotage had a ripple effect that went far beyond what they could have imagined. It caused a major logistical nightmare for the enemy forces, delaying their advance and creating a window of opportunity for the main Allied forces. News of the mysterious landslide, the one that seemed almost surgically precise, spread like wildfire. The enemy couldn't figure out how it happened. It was a ghost story, an unexplained event that sowed fear and confusion. The airmen didn't stop there. Emboldened by their success, they became a phantom menace in the region. They used their knowledge of the terrain and their one-of-a-kind rifle to conduct a guerrilla campaign of pure disruption. They would take out communication lines, trigger smaller rock slides to block patrol routes, and create diversions that drew enemy forces away from key areas. They were ghosts, striking from the shadows and disappearing without a trace. Their legend grew. Locals who supported the Allied cause started leaving food and supplies for the mountain ghosts, the unseen force that was tying the enemy in knots. What started as a desperate bid for survival had turned into one of the most effective and unorthodox resistance campaigns of the war. They proved that courage and ingenuity could be more powerful than any army. A few men with one impossible rifle changed the course of the battle in that region. Their story is a powerful reminder that in the face of impossible odds, the human spirit can achieve the incredible. The air thickened with suspense as Lieutenant Colonel I.C.L. Hambleton, codenamed Bat 21 Bravo, stared at the makeshift rifle. It was a crude assembly of scrap metal, tubing, and a firing mechanism fashioned from a cockpit lever. His hands, though steady, were slick with sweat. Could this really work? The plan was audacious, almost suicidal. Use the rifle to create a diversion, draw the enemy patrols away from his true extraction point, and give the rescue team the window they needed. He had one shot, literally and figuratively, to make this work. The enemy was closing in, their voices echoing through the dense jungle, getting closer with every passing second. Hambleton knew the risks. A misfire could mean instant capture, or worse. But staying put was not an option. His position had been compromised. Taking a deep breath, he checked the single, precious bullet he had managed to craft. It was a clumsy-looking thing, but it just might fly true. He positioned himself on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, a natural choke point for any advancing patrol. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of jungle sounds. He wasn't a sniper, just an electronic warfare officer who'd been shot down. But desperation is a powerful teacher. He recalled every detail from his basic training, every lesson on ballistics he'd ever half listened to. He aimed the heavy, awkward rifle towards a cluster of bamboo on the far side of the valley. His target wasn't a person, but sound. A loud, sharp crack that would echo and make the enemy think he was positioned somewhere he wasn't. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby, too close. He froze. Every muscle tensed. Through the foliage, he saw them, a patrol of 3 soldiers moving cautiously, their weapons ready. They were less than 50 yards away, systematically searching the area. Time was up. It was now or never. He couldn't wait for them to stumble upon him. Shifting his aim slightly, he targeted a large hollow tree trunk further down the valley, hoping the impact would create an even more confusing and disorienting sound. He squeezed the trigger. There was a deafening roar, a powerful kickback that slammed the stock into his shoulder, and a puff of acrid smoke. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, chaos erupted. The patrol immediately took cover, shouting and firing wildly in the direction of the tree trunk, exactly as he'd hoped. They were convinced their target was in that direction, hundreds of yards away from his actual position. This was his chance. While they were distracted, Hambleton scrambled from his hiding spot, moving as quickly and quietly as his exhausted body would allow. He didn't look back. He just ran, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest, heading for the prearranged extraction point. He could hear the faint whir of helicopter blades in the distance, a sound that was either salvation or a mirage. The diversion had worked, but the race against time had just begun. Could he make it to the rescue chopper before the enemy realized they'd been tricked? The final desperate sprint through the jungle would decide his fate. The camp's atmosphere was thick with tension. The guards, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury, stared at the makeshift rifle in the prisoner's hands. It was a crude thing, assembled from salvaged plane parts, yet it held a deadly promise. Their initial shock had morphed into a standoff. For a moment, nobody moved. The wind howled through the desolate camp, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. The prisoner, a man named Alex, knew this was his only chance. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He had spent weeks, months, secretly gathering these components, risking everything for this single moment of defiance. The lead guard, a man known for his cruelty, finally broke the silence. He barked an order, and 2 of his men started to advance, their own weapons raised. Alex didn't flinch. He had anticipated this. He wasn't aiming to start a bloodbath. His goal was much more strategic. He raised the rifle, not at the guards, but towards a rickety watchtower in the corner of the yard. The tower was old, wooden, and crucially, it housed the camp's main communication antenna. Without it, the guards would be cut off, unable to call for reinforcements immediately. It was a gamble, but it was the only one he had. With a deafening crack that echoed across the compound, the rifle fired. The recoil slammed into Alex's shoulder, but his aim was true. A shower of splinters erupted from the watchtower support leg. The structure groaned, swayed precariously, and then, with a final agonizing creak, it began to topple. The guards froze, their eyes wide with disbelief as their vital communication link crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. The prisoners, who had been watching from the barracks with bated breath, erupted into a chaotic roar. This was the signal. The distraction Alex had created was the spark they needed to ignite the flame of rebellion. Chaos erupted. Prisoners surged from the barracks, overwhelming the stunned guards. The carefully planned escape was in motion. Alex didn't wait to see the outcome of the initial skirmish. He used the pandemonium as cover. Melting into the crowd and heading for the predetermined weak point in the fence he and a few others had identified weeks ago. The rifle, having served its purpose, was discarded. It was a tool, not a weapon of vengeance. His mind was clear, focused on one thing and one thing only: freedom. He and his small group slipped through the broken fence, disappearing into the dense, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded the camp. For days, they navigated the treacherous terrain, surviving on what little they could forage. The sounds of pursuit were a constant threat, but they pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and the hope of a life beyond the wire. They were no longer just prisoners. They were survivors, a small band of brothers forged in the crucible of captivity. The journey was grueling, pushing them to their physical and mental limits. But every sunrise brought them closer to their goal, further from their nightmare. The world didn't know their names, but in the heart of that desolate landscape, a legend was born, a story of ingenuity, courage, and the unbreakable will to be free. What would become of them? Only time would tell. As John and Sarah sprinted through the jungle, the sounds of their pursuers grew closer. The air was thick and humid, each breath a struggle. They could hear dogs barking and men shouting, their voices echoing through the dense trees. John clutched the rifle he'd built from plane parts, its weight a strange mix of reassurance and burden. He knew it was their only chance, but it was also the reason they were being hunted so relentlessly. They stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. Sarah, gasping for air, pointed towards a steep, rocky incline. "Up there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It might be our only way to get a vantage point." John nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The sounds were getting dangerously close. He helped Sarah start the climb, the rough rocks digging into their hands. Every loose stone they dislodged felt like a betrayal, a signal to the men below. Halfway up, a spotlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the rock face. They froze, pressing themselves flat against the cold stone. The light passed just over their heads. They held their breath, hearts pounding in their chests. When the light moved on, they scrambled the rest of the way up, collapsing onto a narrow ledge. Peering over the edge, they saw them at least a dozen men, armed and spreading out at the base of the cliff. John knew this was it. He propped the rifle on a rocky outcrop, the makeshift scope glinting in the faint light. His hands were steady, his mind surprisingly clear. He wasn't a soldier, just an engineer who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He took a deep breath, aiming not at the men, but at a large, precariously balanced boulder just above them. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back harder than he expected, the sound deafening in the night air. The bullet struck the rock, a shower of sparks erupting from the impact. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the massive boulder began to shift. It teetered on the edge, then crashed down the cliffside, bringing a cascade of smaller rocks and debris with it. Chaos erupted below. The men scrambled for cover, their shouts turning to cries of alarm. The landslide effectively blocked the path, creating a barrier between them and their pursuers. John grabbed Sarah's hand. "Now's our chance. Let's go." They didn't look back. They pushed deeper into the jungle, using the precious moments the landslide had bought them. They had to find a way to signal for help to get off this island. As dawn broke, they found themselves at the edge of the island, looking out at the vast, empty ocean. They were exhausted, bruised, but alive. In the distance, a tiny speck appeared on the horizon. It grew larger, the distinct shape of a patrol boat becoming clear. Relief washed over them so intensely it almost brought them to their knees. John raised the rifle, not as a weapon, but as a signal, firing a single shot into the air. The boat changed course, heading directly for them. They were finally safe. The ordeal was over, but the memory of their survival and the incredible invention that made it possible would stay with them forever. Suddenly, the engine roared to life and the propeller began to spin. Bill frantically pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun was jammed. He desperately tried to clear the jam, his heart pounding in his chest. But it was too late. The plane, with Carl at the controls, started moving down the improvised runway. It lurched forward, gaining speed with every second. Bill watched in horror as the plane lifted off the ground, its shadow sweeping over him. Carl was getting away. Bill dropped the useless rifle and sprinted after the plane, a desperate, futile chase. He watched it climb higher and higher, a dark shape against the morning sky, until it was just a tiny speck. Then it was gone. Silence descended on the island, broken only by the sound of the waves and Bill's heavy breathing. He had failed. All his efforts, all his ingenuity, had been for nothing. He sank to his knees on the sand, completely defeated. Carl had taken everything: the plane, the supplies, and any hope of rescue. Bill was alone again, truly alone. But as the sun climbed higher, a new feeling began to replace the despair. It was a slow-burning anger. Carl had betrayed him, left him for dead. Bill looked around the island, his new prison. He had survived here once, and he would do it again. But this time, it wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about revenge. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when. But he made a promise to himself right there on the beach. He would get off this island, and he would find Carl. Days turned into weeks. Bill fell back into his old routine, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He improved his shelter, found better food sources, and meticulously organized the few supplies Carl had left behind. He spent his nights staring at the stars, not just looking for rescue, but plotting. He studied the ocean currents, the weather patterns, the flight paths of birds. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a strategist, a hunter waiting for his moment. His mind became his new workshop, forging a plan from the raw materials of desperation and determination. One afternoon, while exploring a part of the island he'd never visited before, he stumbled upon something that made his heart stop. Half buried in the sand was a large, weathered wooden crate. With trembling hands, he pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a satellite phone. It looked old and battered, but there was a chance, a slim chance, it might still work. He frantically checked the battery. It was dead. But next to the phone was a small, hand-cranked solar charger. Hope, fierce and bright, surged through him. For the next 2 days, Bill painstakingly charged the phone, cranking the handle until his arm ached. He didn't sleep, he barely ate. His entire world narrowed down to that small device. Finally, the battery indicator showed a single bar of life. With a deep breath, he turned it on. The screen flickered to life. He had a signal. He didn't know who to call. His hands shook as he tried to remember any number. He decided to try the emergency services. He dialed the number and held the phone to his ear, his entire being focused on the faint sound. A crackle, a hiss, and then a voice. "Emergency operator, what is your location?" Bill's legs gave out, and he sank to the sand, tears streaming down his face. I'm alive," he whispered. Rescue was on its way. But as the relief washed over him, a cold thought followed. The operator had asked for his location. Bill looked at the phone screen. He didn't know how to find his coordinates. Would they be able to find him with just his voice? The single battery bar started to blink. Time was running out. Again. The helicopter pilot, Major Johnson, stared in disbelief at the improvised rifle in Alex's hands. He'd seen a lot in his years of service, but never anything like this. A weapon cobbled together from the wreckage of their own plane. It was a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. Johnson keyed his mic, his voice a low growl of urgency. "Alex, what's your status? Do you have a visual on the hostiles?" Down below, Alex crouched behind a twisted piece of fuselage, the cold metal of his makeshift rifle a stark reality against his cheek. He could see them now, 3 figures moving with tactical precision through the dense jungle foliage, their weapons glinting in the dappled sunlight. They were closing in fast, their movements confident and practiced. They weren't just random opportunists. These were trained professionals. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the jungle. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. The rifle was untested. Would it even fire? And if it did, would it be accurate? There was no room for error. His life, and potentially the lives of the other survivors, depended on this single, desperate gamble. He lined up his shot, the crude sight wobbling as he tried to focus on the lead figure. The man was carrying a heavy pack and what looked like a satellite phone. The leader, most likely. Taking him out would sow confusion and buy them precious time. Contact, 3 hostiles, approximately 100 meters and closing. Southeast quadrant. Alex whispered into his comms, his voice tight with tension. Engaging the leader. Major Johnson's voice crackled back, strained. Negative, Alex. Do not engage. Your position is compromised. We need to get you out of there. Hold your fire and await extraction. But Alex knew it was too late. The hostiles had already spotted movement. The lead figure raised a hand, signaling his team to halt. He lifted a pair of binoculars, scanning the wreckage directly where Alex was hiding. Their eyes met for a split second across the 100-meter gap. There was no more hiding, no more waiting. It was now or never. With a silent prayer, Alex gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with a surprisingly powerful kick. The sound a deafening crack that shattered the jungle's tranquility. It was louder than he expected, a raw, unrefined explosion of force. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the lead hostile crumpled to the ground, dropping his binoculars and clutching his chest. A clean hit. The other 2 figures immediately dove for cover, returning fire with a furious barrage of automatic weapons. Bullets tore through the air around Alex, ripping into the metal fuselage he used for cover, sending sparks flying. The sound was a terrifying roar, a hailstorm of lead that pinned him down. He scrambled back, his ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. He had done it. The rifle worked, but he had also just kicked a hornet's nest. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and his only cover was a flimsy piece of aluminum. From the air, Major Johnson watched the firefight erupt below. He swore under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. He engaged. I need immediate air support on Alex's position. Lay down suppressing fire on the tree line southeast of the crash site. The helicopter banked sharply, its minigun spinning to life. A torrent of bullets rained down on the jungle, shredding leaves and branches, forcing the 2 remaining hostiles to keep their heads down. This was the opening Alex needed. He ejected the spent shell casing a modified piece of metal, tubing and fumbled for another one of his handmade cartridges. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind racing. He had to move. Staying put was a death sentence. Under the cover of the helicopter's suppressing fire, Alex broke from his cover, sprinting towards a denser patch of jungle 20 yards away. It felt like the longest 20 yards of his life. He dove behind a massive banyan tree, just as the helicopter's guns went silent to cool down. The return fire from the ground immediately intensified, bullets thudding into the thick trunk of his new cover. He was safe for the moment, but trapped. He reloaded his rifle, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. He had confirmed 2 hostiles remaining. The helicopter could provide cover, but it couldn't land with active ground fire. He was on his own down here. He had to eliminate the threat, or they would never be able to rescue the injured survivors, including his mentor. Mr. Henderson. The fate of everyone rested on his shoulders, on a weapon born from desperation and scrap metal. Peeking around the tree, he saw one of the hostiles trying to flank his position, moving from tree to tree. The hunt was on. But what Alex didn't know was that these weren't the only hostiles in the area. A second team was approaching from the north, silent and unseen, drawn by the sound of the firefight. The situation was about to get a whole lot more complicated. In the face of the oncoming bear, David's mind raced, his survival instincts screaming. He knew the rifle, his makeshift creation from salvaged plane parts, was his only hope. But would it even fire? The question hammered in his head with every thunderous beat of his heart. The bear rose to its full, terrifying height, a mountain of fur and fury, its roar echoing through the desolate landscape. David scrambled backward, his hands fumbling to load the single precious bullet he had crafted. His fingers were numb with cold and fear, but he forced them to obey. He had to get this right. One shot, that's all he had. The bear dropped back to all fours and charged. The ground shook beneath its powerful strides. Time seemed to slow down. David raised the rifle to his shoulder, the cold metal a stark contrast to his clammy skin. He squinted down the makeshift barrel, trying to steady his shaking hands. The roaring beast filled his vision, a blur of dark fur and snapping jaws. He remembered the countless hours he'd spent meticulously assembling this weapon, pouring all his knowledge and desperation into its construction. It wasn't just metal and wood, it was his will to live. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He aimed for the center of the charging mass, the largest target he could find. The bear was almost on him, its hot breath fogging the frigid air. He could smell its wild, musky scent. Closing his eyes for a split second, he pulled the trigger. An ear-splitting crack shattered the silence of the wilderness, far louder than he had anticipated. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, knocking him off his feet and onto the hard, frozen ground. For a moment, there was only a ringing in his ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He lay there, dazed, his eyes struggling to focus. Did it work? Was he still alive? He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. A few yards away, the massive bear lay motionless in the snow. A dark stain was slowly spreading across its thick coat. A wave of disbelief, followed by an overwhelming surge of relief, washed over him. He had done it. His impossible rifle had actually worked. Staggering to his feet, David approached the fallen animal cautiously. It was a somber sight. He felt no triumph, only a profound sense of respect and a deep, gut-wrenching sadness for the magnificent creature. This was the harsh reality of survival, a brutal dance he was forced to learn. The bear would provide him with food, a warm pelt, and a renewed chance to endure this unforgiving wilderness. It was a grim gift, but a life-saving one. As he stood over the bear, the setting sun cast long shadows across the snow, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The immediate danger was over, but he knew this was just one victory in a long, arduous war for survival. The rifle was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of his resilience. But what other challenges lay ahead in the frozen expanse? What would he do now? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see what happens next in this incredible story of survival.